Hello, I'm Terrence McNally, and welcome to today's podcast. I say every week that this radio show consists of interviews with people that I believe have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. And my intention is that if you listen to the show a few times, you begin to see how we could do things differently. I mean, all sorts of things: education, healthcare, politics, business, media, community. You may even begin to see a future of revolutionary, evolutionary, and visionary success. Many of those new ways arise out of a vision that I hold, that reality is not dead, mechanical, or separate, but that reality is alive, evolving, and composed of interdependent systems. And I believe this worldview has been shared by indigenous peoples for millennia, revealed by science since early in the 20th century, and obvious every time we walk out the door and look into the eyes of another living creature. It is this worldview that inspires the annual Bioneers conference that takes place each fall in the San Francisco Bay Area and now streams via satellite to sites across the country. The conference, this year, October 19th to 21st in San Rafael, is a gathering of scientific and social innovators who draw from 4 billion years of evolutionary intelligence and apply nature's operating instructions to develop and implement visionary and practical models for restoring the earth, its communities, its people. For the most part, the solutions to our problems already exist. Human creativity focused on problem solving can explode the mythology of despair. The Bioneers focus on the creative social strategies that can help us realize these solutions by restoring community, justice, democracy. They herald an age of interdependence founded in nature's principles of diversity, kinship, community, cooperation, and reciprocity. Speakers this year include Bill McKibben, Paul Hawken, Ethan Nadelman of the Drug Policy Alliance, Gabor Mate, the author of In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, LA's own Jody Evans of Code Pink, and Andy Lipkiss of Tree People. In addition to talking today with Kenny Ausubel about Bioneers, Kenny is the founder and co-director, we will also be joined by Ellen Brown, who is one of the speakers at this year's conference. She's president of the Public Banking Institute and the author of Web of Debt. In addition to founding and co-directing Bioneers, Kenny Ausubel co-founded Seeds of Change, a biodiversity organic seed company. He authored the book Seeds of Change, Restoring the Earth, Visionary Solutions from the Bioneers, and When Healing Becomes a Crime. Recently, he edited the first 2 titles in the Bioneers book series with J.P. Harpiginis: Ecological Medicine, Healing the Earth, Healing Ourselves, and Nature's Operating Instructions, The True Biotechnology. His newest book, just out, is Dreaming the Future, Reimagining Civilization in the Age of Nature. Welcome, Kenny.
Terrence, my pleasure to be with you and Ellen today.
Great. As you know, I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work that we talk about. So, for those who haven't ever heard you, what path led you to the work you do today?
Very good question. You know, I had a pretty severe health crisis when I was about 19 or 20, which later turned out to be the consequence of an environmental exposure to a toxin. And it was partly through that obviously I became very interested in the state of the environment.
Right.
And I ended up making a film in the 80s called Hoxie, When Healing Becomes a Crime, really about the politics of cancer and of the suppression of alternative, promising, unconventional cancer treatments.
Let me just cut in for 1 second in case people didn't hear that. Was Hoxie, because you can find this online, right? And purchase it and everything. It's Hoxie, Hoxey, correct?
Hoxsey.
S-E-Y. There you go. Okay, continue.
Yeah, and because the Hoxie story was centered on a botanical remedy, I did a great deal of research about plant medicine, and one thing led me to another, and I ended up co-founding Seeds of Change as a result of that, to my first foray into agricultural biodiversity. And in the course of that, one by one, I was just curious what else was out there in the way of solutions. These are such fundamental problems that, Hoxie, although it's not a magic bullet or a panacea as a cancer treatment, clearly a good number of people do get well. And I figured there must be other solutions out there. And one by one, I began to come across these remarkable individuals who had come up with really fundamental systemic solutions to major challenges in the world. And I came to call them Bioneers because the pattern among them was that they had looked to nature to essentially ask the disarmingly simple question, how would nature do it?
Right.
And that's how I came to call them Bioneers. And in 1990, we pulled together a conference, not really knowing what we were doing, frankly, to just bring some of these people together. And it was a remarkable experience. It was clear, the premise from day one in 1990 has been the solutions are largely present, or we know what directions to head in. And it's a vast web of interdependence, not just in the natural world, but after all, as human beings, we're part of nature, not apart from it. And we have to look at human civilization in the context of being a subset of nature. As the Archbishop of Canterbury said, the environment is the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, and so now I'm just before I turn over to Ellen, this will be what? This will be 22?
23.
23. Well, exciting. And so, as I said, this Bioneers conference, in which all of these sorts of thinkers and doers are brought together, will take place in San Rafael, October 19th to 21st. And you are offering a discount code for listeners to this program to attend the conference. Can you give that out?
Absolutely. We'd be delighted. It's B as in boy, C as in cat, 12, T as in Tom, D as in duh, 1 as in one, and A as in arc.
Okay, BC12 TD1A.
Yeah.
So when someone goes online to buy a ticket to this year's conference, they put in that code, they get a discount.
That's correct. It's 20% off if you do all 3 days, or it's 10% per day.
Okay, very good. So that's Kenny Ausubel. Now, Ellen Brown. Ellen Brown is an attorney and president of the Public Banking Institute. In Web of Debt, her latest of 11 books, she shows how a private cartel has usurped the power to create money from the people themselves and how we the people can get it back. Her websites are webofdebt.com, ellenbrown.com, and Public Banking Institute, one word, .org. Welcome, Ellen.
Thanks, Terrence.
Okay, your turn. Briefly describe your path to the work that you're doing today. Not the thing you did today or yesterday, but kind of how you've evolved to the things you focus on right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Kenny's story was very interesting because that's actually how I got into this too. In that, I had written a number of books. I don't think I'd finished all. I have 10 books on health and alternative healthcare, and I had written most of them, and some of them were with a co-author, and we had seen the movie Hoxie Quack, Who Cures Cancer.
Oh, my gosh.
It was quite shocking and eye-opening, and so we did a tour of the Tijuana cancer clinics, and I was thinking I would write about them. And then one of the therapists, or one of the healers there, Jimmy Keller, wound up in jail, and one of his, my co-author's secretary was actually one of his patients, and so she called me and said, Jimmy's in jail and he needs an attorney and all this, and so, first they needed somebody to write an article. So I did, and he liked it, and he didn't trust his attorneys, so he asked me to help with his lawsuit, and so I wound up being on his legal team, and I wrote a book called Forbidden Medicine, which was all about him, and he wound up spending 4.5 years in jail, and it was all totally kangaroo court sort of thing from my point of view. And I mean, the charge was that he was alleging that he had a cancer cure. Well, in my opinion, he did, and I had seen all those patients. And he started out with Hoxie. That he had cancer himself. It was a malignant melanoma in his ear, and they cut off his ear and told him he was going to die. And so he went to Hoxie. I mean, he actually met Hoxie the man in Texas, and that turned his cancer around, and he was so impressed that then he got into every other form of alternative healthcare. So his whole program was very eclectic, and so he was sort of a personification of the whole movement. But in the course of that, I did a lot of research on the whole alternative cancer and how alternative healthcare and how it had been suppressed. And in the course of that, I learned that the cancer cartel was essentially the banking cartel. I mean, they got their power from the same place. it was Rockefeller and Morgan at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. Before 1913, they both had banks, of course, and they could actually literally print banknotes. Before 1913, when the Federal Reserve took over the printing of the U.S. currency, banks just printed their own banknotes, supposedly backed by gold, but they printed many more notes than they had gold. And that was where they got their funding, and through that funding, they did all sorts of things to turn medicine into something that was totally drug-oriented. It was patent medicine, or patent drugs, rather than things that supported the body. They were things that suppressed what the body was trying to do. So
at what point do you shift from alternative health to, if we could, alternative economics?
Well, that was when I realized that if you wanted to get to the root of the problem, you had to go for the banking system, that there was something fundamentally wrong with our banking system. Right now, 35% of everything we buy goes to interest, according to Margaret Kennedy, who's a German researcher. So that's because every business funds their production on credit, and so if you add up all those levels of production, they have to pay their workers and materials before they have a product to sell, and they don't get paid until 90 days net usually, so they have to carry their business all that time, so they have to borrow, so there's interest at every level. If you add them all up, that's 35% of everything we buy goes to the financial sector, which does nothing except basically extract rents for lending money that isn't even their own money. It's our money. So it just seems intuitively obvious if we had public banks, in other words.
Right. We're going to definitely talk about public banks. So that brings you up to where now your focus is on the Public Banking Institute, the books, the work, the articles, and so on that have to do with this. I'm going to come back to Kenny. We established this is the 23rd Bioneers. Is there a particular focus this year, or what particularly excites you about the upcoming conference, the 19th, 21st in San Rafael?
Well, we've called the overall theme of the conference this year emergence, which really signifies two things. From my perspective, having very closely tracked this world that we're talking about for the last 23 years, in the beginning in 1990, you could literally count the number of people in a given field on your fingers, on one hand usually, and it was easy to know who was who. Now, I can't keep up with one field. The growth, the emergence of this movement of movements and network of networks for what's called sustainability is just really reaching a critical mass. And what emergence also signifies, it's a term in biology that means that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and novelty emerges when all these different dynamics occur. So in the same sense that right now we're facing problems that the world has literally never faced before, such as globalized, climate change and collapse, ecological systems collapse on a global scale, with those problems emerge the seeds of new solutions. And so all of that will be very visible, and we talk about it as being moving from breakdown to breakthrough, reimagining civilization in the age of nature. And within that, we've got several very strong sort of meta themes this year. One is around climate action, and we have three of the top, people in that field of different, dimensions of it. Mike Brune, who's the head of Sierra Club, is going to talk about their extraordinary success shutting down hundreds of coal plants across the country, with including now most recently $50 million in funding from Michael Bloomberg of New York. Sandra Steingraber, who's a deep biologist and environmental health researcher, is going to be doing a plenary related to fracking. Mm-hmm. What Sandra told me, what we didn't know we were doing on top of everything else, is that the surface of the earth is formed from below. And when you go down 7,000 or 8,000 feet, there are vast coral reefs of microbes that actually create the surface that we live on, and live with. And she's been an extraordinary activist in New York State stopping fracking there, or attempting to. And then we've also got, of course, Bill McKibben, whose recent Rolling Stone article, Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, has just, gone over the moon in terms of its circulation. And we have multiple campaign connection sessions where you can get directly involved with very serious national and global campaigns to, as an individual, really take meaningful action. So That's going to be powerful stuff. And then I do want to say, thank you to Ellen for her wonderful work. I'm a big fan of her book, Web of Debt. She'll be speaking at the conference on a very, very cutting-edge panel that is about banking, really restructuring the entire banking industry. And along with her, we'll have representatives speaking to the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, which is 19 banks around the world, partly funded by the Rockefeller Fund, that are showing that you can actually have a triple bottom line, people, planet, and profits, and be more successful in terms of your return on investment, the success of the loans that you make, all the metrics that are used. And one of the keys is scale. When we say they're really too big not to fail, the existing banks, and just breaking up the banks has got to happen. So we're going to be, putting a lot of emphasis on that, as well as on how you build regional economies. One of the other very interesting points, there's a great new report from the International Forum on Globalization called Outing the Oligarchy. And one of the points they make is that the concentration of wealth is 2 times as great as it was in ancient Rome, which was a slave society, literally, no joke. And that, in fact, what's really propping up the fossil fuel industry today is a handful of rogue billionaires who have bought the political system and are driving this. And unless we go after that, then we're really just kind of, dancing around the edges.
What you said is interesting. In other words, we have a political system that is, at least in this country, is no longer representative democracy except in name, because of the flood of money, both to influence elections and then even more so to influence what happens after elections. And what you're saying is that it is no accident that some of the billionaires who've made their billions from fossil fuels are the leaders in dominating the government and the political system. So that it's like you make money because you're doing fossil fuels and you have tons of subsidies. Then you take that money to keep hold of the government and thus keep it from moving forward to deal with climate action.
Precisely. These interests have essentially captured the political system, and what we really live in now is a democracy theme park, And so it's no accident that the concentration of wealth and the extremes of inequality are that climate change is very much also a symptom of that now. And we've got to be moving to more, one of the big words that's now in play, we've been at it for 5 or 6 years with it, is resilience. The idea that, the big wheels of ecological governance are turning right now, and we're going to be, busier than a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, as they say, trying to adapt to these radically changing conditions. And what you want to do is build resilience so that you have the capacity to adapt and so forth. So what's happening, and we have a whole day on this, actually, the day before the main conference starts, is how do you build a national and global network of resilient communities? Because there are extraordinary adaptations that people are coming up with, including right there in Los Angeles, your backyard, Terrence, with Andy Lipkus and Tree People, who have done extraordinary work creating the first ever major urban department of a watershed. And not only did they save the city a ton of money, those funds could then be redirected to do the work of restoration that actually needs to be done. So there's many examples of that kind of thing. And but, until I recommend very highly this report, Outing the Oligarchy, by the International Forum on Globalization, which really details the Billionaires Club.
Would I be correct that that's ifg.org?
Yes.
Okay, IF as in Frank, ifg.org, Outing the Oligarchs.
At the Oligarchy.
Oh.
And there was just a new book that's also come out just recently that shows, as Ellen was indicating, but 50% of the tax breaks that Romney is advocating for go to the 0.01% of the population at the top end of the top end.
Yeah, amazing.
That's where we are.
Okay. Ellen, I'm going to get back to you on public banking in just a second, but I want to talk just a bit, if you will, with me, Kenny, because it's both a theme of the Bioneers Conference and a theme of your book, Dreaming the Future, which is, for those of you who've been listening, what we're saying is learn from nature, mimic nature. Nature has systems and interactions that have developed over 3.5 billion years. We, as human beings, and especially as Western civilization over the last 150 or so, kind of found a way to live as if nature didn't bat last through fossil fuels and a few other things. That era is ending, and we've got to now readjust to the reality that we were ignoring for, as I say, about a century and a half. So what that ends up being is you look at principles in nature and you see how they apply in human systems. Let's talk about this concept of resilience, okay? What does that really mean and give it to me in terms of nature and in terms of human society?
Sure. Well, the most fundamental systems error that we've committed as a civilization is to think that we're apart from nature rather than a part of it. When you fight nature, you lose. It's really that simple. And one of the key principles of nature is decentralization. You don't want these systems that are so concentrated and so tightly connected that one catastrophic event can crash the whole system. Look, witness the banking crisis, perfect example of that kind of, over-centralization. So what that means in very practical terms is you want to start to decentralize the food system. You want to become much more locally oriented. And, it's both and. Obviously, not every, if I live in New Mexico, do I want to live without rice or mangoes or coffee? Or probably not, most people don't. So it's fine to have a balance, but you want to be much more locally self-reliant, and it also builds a local economy, which also creates jobs and keeps the wealth in the community. Similarly, energy systems. And by the way, we'll have Colonel Mark Puck Mickleby, Marine Colonel, at the conference this year, who just recently resigned as the Chief Strategic Assistant to the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And Colonel Mickleby came to the conclusion, which is apparently where about half of the Department of Defense is at now, that national security is domestic environmental security. And that what we need to precisely do is not only to move to renewables, but to get much more decentralized, regionalized, and localized systems. Same for food. And then a massive push to educate people. And the military itself is basically going green.
Let me ask a quick question on that, Kenny. As you were saying that, what occurred to me was that in a world like a World War II world, or even a Cold War world, where you sort of had big centralized powers like the U.S. and the Soviet Union and so on, that was sort of very centralized warfare. And I think in that regard, the Defense Department thinks centralized. What I heard in what you were saying was that even our military threats are now decentralized. But it sounds like what he has realized and what the wiser folks in defense have realized, that national security is about threats other than military threats, and that those threats are decentralized. So now you need an approach to defense that is also decentralized. Would that be correct?
That's exactly right, Terence. Very astute. And, their perspective here is also, it certainly carries a military component. If the U.S. Eliminates our reliance on fossil fuels, then we don't need to be in the Middle East fighting wars in the first place. It's very straightforward. And climate change is essentially, we've provoked the environment into becoming a hostile power. I mean, quite literally. And, the DOD, it's quite ironic because the military is also one of the greatest sources of innovation for many years. And this is where GPS came from, and, the early microprocessors and, a whole long list of technological innovations. They're all over it now in terms of renewable energy and doing a lot of their own invention. And they know that their leverage as a market maker is huge. If they do that, number one, they have a lot of clients, that they buy from, so it can start an industry, but it can also leverage that industry nationally, and they're quite conscious of that.
Very, very good. And so, what I would say, anyone who thinks about it, when you have a volume, when a market becomes large, then there are gains to everyone from that. Government procurement and defense procurement, when they make a decision that something has to be a certain way, now it becomes mass. The price can drop. The efficiencies can come in and so on. So that is exciting. Let me ask one thing, and then I'm going to go to Ellen for a bit. My guess is that most of my listeners and myself, and certainly the general public, doesn't know this about the Defense Department. Is the Defense Department purposely not publicizing it, or is it just that in the in the what news and culture pays attention to, we're missing it?
Well, it hasn't been widely reported on yet, but it is starting to seep out into the media. We also, as you know, produce the annual Bioneers radio series, which I believe KPFK also airs.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our shows this season has Amory Lovins, who has worked with the Department of Defense for decades now, and David Orr, who is also very involved there from Oberlin. And they talk about this quite explicitly, and it is starting to, percolate out from the DoD. But we'll be hearing, here's their perspective. One, hacker can take down the grid now. You've got this vast centralized Rube Goldberg, system. 4 bridges go down on the Mississippi River, and New York City is hungry 48 hours later. So within the DoD, apparently it's about split down the middle of, the containment Cold War mentality to what Colonel Mickleby calls a new national security narrative of sustainment instead of containment. But we'll be hearing a lot more about that. And, so anyway, I'll stop there.
Okay. Ellen, let me ask a big question first, and then we'll go into more of the particulars of public banking. But here's a big, broad question. I have long watched as the American economy became financialized, that the amount of jobs, money, profits, everything that's in the financial sector has been growing sort of inexorably since the 70s. And at the same time as it's been growing larger and larger, having more and more influence on society, it has been going away from what it seems to me, in the best of all possible worlds, is the function of a financial sector, and that is to invest in innovation, to invest in the future, to allow that function to happen in society. And now it has become basically a casino game with more and more exotic instruments to gamble on and so on. How can banks and the financial sector help support and build a sustainable society?
Well, when you're talking about the natural model versus the model we have right now is basically a parasitic model. I mean, if you're looking for something in nature where the parasite is sucking profits out of the economy, and that parasite on the side is growing exponentially, and something that's not found in nature. So what you need as a natural model would be more of the beehive model, the cooperative, where everybody shares, and basically the product of banks is credit, and credit is actually the full faith and credit of the United States. It's ours. It's we the people's credit. It's not actually a property of the banks. So if we had our own public banks, we could then share this credit in a way that it feeds the economy rather than feeding off the economy, and we could save the 35% that gets siphoned off into these capital accounts that just keep growing sort of on the side on their own. More money making more money rather than money making products.
And investing in a society that's moving forward. Let me ask you a question about evolution. Now, by the way, I heard David Graeber speak within the last year about his big tome Debt, which was eye-opening to me like crazy. But that's the totally long-term picture. He takes it back to David Graeber is one of the founders of the Occupy movement and an anthropologist, and he takes his study of debt back to the earliest societies. But I'm assuming that there was a time when banks were more local, when banks were more related to their communities, because the need, that is to say, I want to build a bridge or I want to do something that I don't have all the capital for, has been there, and a bank would fill that. How did we evolve to the point we're at now?
Well, it's true that the myth is that that money evolved from barter, but Graeber shows that that's not true. If you look at primitive societies, they don't actually do barter; they do gifting. They're like big families, and they share. But if you go back farther than gold bugs are always talking about gold being the longest lived and most stable commodity or money ever known, but that's not true. If you go back to the Sumerians, that civilization, that's the first ever civilization, if you define civilization as having a written language, and they developed their written language originally to take, it was numbers, it was to take care of accounting. So they actually started with a temple system that it was the goddess Inanna was it was the temple under, there was a matriarchy, and the temple was basically the bank that they kept all these accountings, and they kept them on in these cuneiform writings, where they kept track of who owed what to whom. But they didn't actually use money. All they had, it was just an accounting system. It was just numbers, keeping track of IOUs and comparative prices. And they fixed the prices, so they were the same for hundreds of years, and the interest was the same for hundreds of years. And that model worked very well. That lasted for 2,000 years in one single civilization. But the problem was they were using all kinds of commodities. So they were using corn and wheat and so forth. Like the Egyptians had actually grain banks where they would store grain, and you would take your grain to the grain bank and get a little piece of pottery that showed it was like a receipt for your grain, and then you could trade that. But grain would rot. That was the problem. And so silver and gold obviously didn't rot, and so they became the dominant currency. But the trouble was they also didn't grow. So if you
once you shift out of something which is renewable to something which is not renewable as your currency, I would imagine there's a philosophical change there in worldview.
Yeah, so that's where U Street came in, and then exponential growth of numbers that didn't reflect any kind of growth in nature. And so that resulted in slavery, and it's been the whole fall of Rome has been blamed on exponential debt.
So, but let's move up to, let's say, a century or two ago, when America was young and moving west and innovating and so on. How did they fund things?
Well, the original colonies, the American colonies invented the system of paper money, where these pieces of paper were just little receipts for goods and services delivered to the government. And that model, particularly the Pennsylvania model, which was Benjamin Franklin's colony of Pennsylvania, that he wrote about it and popularized this whole system. That system was totally sustainable, and it worked very well. They didn't have gold, and they didn't have, their alternative was to borrow from the British bankers, which then put them in debt. Plus, there weren't even that many British banks around, so they just really didn't have money. So they issued their own, and then in Pennsylvania, they issued this money and lent it to the farmers. So it would come back. They would lend most of it and spend a little on the budget. So you would have enough out there to pay principal and interest. It would all come back as principal and interest. You could lend the principal again and spend the interest, and it would all come back. It was a totally sustainable system. It didn't require exponential growth like the banker system did, where the bankers were always taking back more than they put out. And so you had to scramble to find that extra, and you had to either take it from other people or somebody had to go bankrupt. It was always a competitive scarcity sort of system.
Let me ask you, because I'm learning as you speak, and I'm sort of ruminating about this. It sounds like what you're saying is that the debt-based financial system, which has interest above, there's 100% of an exchange, and now there's interest added onto that, demands exponential growth, and so our very the system that defies nature and has us in such trouble now, as people try to say, well, you can't constantly grow because ultimately we as you said, Kenny, we are a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. There are limits. Am I correct that the financial system of exponential growth is what ends up demanding that of our culture?
Exactly. And that's the 35% that's added on to the cost of every product. so the producers have to raise their prices beyond what they pay their workers, so the workers never have enough money to buy these products, so then they have to borrow, which just increases this exponential growth system.
Yeah, well, I'm not even talking so much about, that fact. It's the fact that it demands, it's why we always hear, GDP is up and things like that. It's that we feel like to be in a steady state, to be in a sustainable state is not success. Success is you have to be adding to it. You have to be carving out new territory, new products, new customers, and so on to pay that. Now take us up to what is public banking and how is that different?
In public banking, basically the profits go back to the public, and so it is sustainable because you're getting all that extra back. So we have one public bank in the U.S., the Bank of North Dakota. North Dakota was the only state that escaped the credit crisis. They have the lowest unemployment rate in the country. Business is booming. They have the lowest default rate. They didn't get involved in the subprime crisis because they didn't have to, because they had their own sort of Federal Reserve system that supported the banks, provided the capital, allowing them to hold the loans on their own books. But the problem is that North Dakota also has oil, so people say, well, they have oil and that's why they're doing so well. But there are other states that have oil that are not doing so well. And globally, 40% of banks globally are publicly owned, and these are largely in the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which also have 40% of the global population. And those countries also beat the credit crisis. They have shown a remarkable, in the last decade, they've grown 92%, and 10% a year China has kept up that 10% a year for the last 30 years, I think. So this is largely because of their credit system. The credit goes back to the center. It feeds the economy instead of feeding off the economy.
So you still take out loans, you still lend money, you still charge interest, but it doesn't go outside the system. It stays within the system and replenishes the system within that state or within whatever entity this public bank exists to serve?
Right.
And that sounds like nature.
Right.
So, if a public bank in the state of North Dakota works so well, why is there only one in the state of North Dakota? Why hasn't that spread, if not 10 years ago, 15 years ago, since the crisis?
Well, they were wise enough to keep a low profile, so you never hear about them. And there are other countries that do this that also keep a low profile, and they've gotten away with it. Any country that has been too brazen about it has gotten attacked and suppressed. And I'm actually writing about that now, a whole book on public banking. But there's a whole history of, for example, the ideal model was the Commonwealth Bank of Australia from 1912 to 1923. It was a publicly owned central bank which used the power of credit to fund all sorts of things, railways, roadways, businesses of all sorts, and they funded Australia's participation in World War I without borrowing from the City of London. But the City of London was keeping control of their prior colonies through debt. And so they couldn't have this model existing that showed that an ex-colony could be independent and could just print its own money and fund its own economy and its own government. So, the head of the bank died rather suddenly after he bragged about it, and then they replaced him with a committee that knuckled under to they changed the whole system, and then they did that elsewhere.
Right, but let Ellen, in the U.S., I'm saying, what is the barrier to public banks arising, and hasn't California been attempting to establish one?
California had a bill that passed both houses of the legislature a year ago for a study to determine the feasibility of a state-owned bank. So it passed, but the governor didn't sign it. He said that, we don't need another study, and we could do this in-house. We have a banking committee, but will they? Apparently not.
And which governor was that?
The current governor.
Brown.
Governor Brown. Yeah.
Okay. And so what's the status right now?
Then another bill was brought in the spring that was actually for a state-owned bank. It was brought by the same man in San Diego. But it was pretty clear that one wasn't going to get out of committee, so they withdrew it, and I guess they're going to try again. But I would say the main problem, of course, you have the big banks they will lose their...
Right.
They get these deposits right now, which are huge deposits. What they get from states is a huge part of their...
Yeah, state pension funds and so on are huge players, and when they convert to this system, it changes the game. So, but how are they stopping this from happening?
I think it's because people don't really understand. Even the small banks don't understand why this serves them. It's really the small banks against the big banks. We need to support our local banks. Those are the ones that make the loans to small business. They support the local economy, and the Wall Street banks have lost interest in that. They're mostly just speculating now.
That's right.
Or doing international type derivatives. Derivatives is the biggest portion of J.P. Morgan's business.
So let me ask you this: is there any downside to public banking to the larger society? Not obviously, there's a downside to its competitors, but is there a downside to public banking?
No. I would say no, not now, because we have the capacity to have total transparency and total accountability. You could point to public banks decades ago where you couldn't see what was going on, and therefore corrupt politicians were able to manipulate them. But today, the politicians prefer private banks because they can manipulate them much more easily than you could a real public banking system with full transparency and accountability.
Okay, and if you are interested in seeing this move forward, what could a listener do?
Our website is publicbankinginstitute.org, and we have groups in most states that are working toward the first thing I think is for people to just understand what we're talking about. It would be good to do an initiative. That would be the ideal way to get a public bank started. But at this point, if you went into a grocery store and you tried to get people to sign your initiative, they wouldn't know what you're talking about.
Right. So what we're talking about is the first stage is a real public education campaign.
Right.
So go to publicbankinginstitute.org, learn what you can, spread the word. This is, as we say, the reason that you're at Bioneers and the reason you're on this phone call to talk about this is because this is banking the way nature would do it versus banking the way financial wizards do it. Let me turn back to you, Kenny. Because you do have a new book that I think just came out called Dreaming the Future, and I was surprised because your previous last few books have been basically editing books. That is to say, you took the best of talks at Bioneers conferences, turned them into articles, and edited those around certain themes. This one is your own essays, correct?
Yes.
And tell me why you did that. In other words, you're busy running a conference, you were busy editing things. What led you to do this book yourself?
Yeah, well, as you indicate, I have a very full life with my day job with Bioneers, and having long stretches of concentrated time for writing has been hard for me the last few years. So what I did is actually pull together various writings I've done over about the last 5 to 10 years, some of which has been for Bioneers, and skimmed it to kind of pick the cream of a lot of the big ideas and the meta trends and the real kind of game changers and breakthroughs that I've witnessed over the last decade or so, and to really, present a kind of kaleidoscope of those views. And it touches on many of the things that we're discussing here today, including public banking and things of that nature. So it was, and my daughter, who's now a writer, a successful writer.
Novelist, correct?
Yeah. No One Is Here Except All of Us is the name of her first wonderful novel, and but she helped me to edit it all, which was a real godsend for me. It's hard to go back to stuff you've done. So.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, but I just wanted to add one thing to what Ellen is saying.
Oh, go right ahead.
Yeah, a couple just to follow up on something that you said earlier. But there's I think the main barrier is public education and then political action. And both things like public banking or what I mentioned earlier, the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, which you can Google on the web, there is a growing movement that it's only a matter of when, not if, it's going to break through. We know there's going to be more and more financial meltdowns with the current system. It's systemic. It's not an accident. It's part of the system. So there is my sense is that there's a critical mass, and that's why I'm so excited to have Ellen and some other, the New Resource Bank will be speaking, the Rabobank. They're private banks, but they're very much working in communities on the ground, very high value proposition in terms of what they do, not just their bottom line. But one other interesting complexity and something that we're going to be featuring in a big way at Bioneers this year is what we call feminomics. And, women's leadership is rising around the world. It's very clear this is going to be one of the decisive factors in the fate of the earth at this point. But I was wondering, what are some practical handles for that? How could you help to really, mobilize that energy in very tangible ways? And the data show over and over and over that where you have a critical mass of women managing money and finance and economies, things go much better. And there's a lot of reasons that might be the case, but that is the proverbial bottom line. And so we've pulled together a whole one-day intensive to spin the dial and really look at the dimensions of how women manage money differently. And I think that also has to be in our thinking here as we go forward. The more women we can get in positions of financial clout, the better off we're all going to be. So.
And that is a day that will take, that you said that in Penn, that takes place the day before the Bioneers Conference?
It's the day after.
The day after.
22nd of October. And just to follow up on one thing that you raised before about resilience, Terence.
Yes.
Apart from the ecological principles of resilience, which are in my book, by the way, there's a whole chapter on that. The other key factor as to whether communities make it or not is social ties, is social capital. Peace means coming back to the table. Wherever you have deep, ongoing relationships among people in community, those are the communities that get through these massive crises and challenges. And we're also going to be looking at that very closely at the conference, including there's tremendous energy coming out of the faith-based world now. We have a wonderful man named Fletcher Harper from Green Faith, which is organizing congregations all over the country to not only go green, but really educate people and address social issues. And we've got Gabor Mate, whom I know you've had on your show, who talks about the underlying causes of trauma and addiction as being social causes. They're not just your personal problem, And Richard Tarnas, the author of Cosmos and Psyche, an extraordinary view into the evolutionary archetypal progression that we're in right now of these two conflicting worldviews of hyper-individualistic, materialistic, endless growth versus what you might call the indigenous mind, of a world of balance. So there's a lot about the inner world as well. And then we've got a whole big program on the Amazon that includes a plenary by Marina Silva from Brazil, who was the child of rubber tappers and went on to become Lula's Minister of the Environment and did amazing things around conservation, and now most recently ran for the president of Brazil and got 19% of the vote on the Green Party platform. So she's a spark plug and quite remarkable. But there's, the Amazon is under threat again right now with oil development, and if the Amazon goes, we're all toast. So this is just incredibly important stuff.
Right, and I know you have folks from Pachamama as well, and for those who have listened to the show before, they have been involved with Ecuador, and Ecuador was the first nation to put the rights of nature into its constitution, and for the last few years you've usually had something to do with that as well.
Yes, we're very close partners with the Pachamama Alliance, and I just went on one of their super journeys into the Ecuadorian Amazon this summer, and they're going to be in full force at the conference. In fact, they're bringing up 2 Achuar indigenous leaders, and we're going to have some time on the main stage to share exactly what's going on in the Amazon right now and how to stop it. And President Correa, who has been quite progressive in a number of ways, is open to all of this. And in fact, the rights of nature work came to the Pachamama Alliance through Bioneers because we'd been having it at the conference, and one thing led to another, and suddenly it ended up in the Ecuadorian Constitution. And
that's right. As you and I believe, 2 years ago, the guest that I had on with you was Tom Lindsay, who has been such an instrumental player in that rights of nature piece.
Yeah, and it's not unconnected as well in Latin America to the drug war. And we've got, Ethan Nadelman from Drug Policy Alliance. This is one of the greatest examples of a very rapid change that could be made that would both, level the playing field in terms of social and racial justice, but also save, up to $80 billion a year is being spent on the drug war, depending how you calculate the math. But instead, that could be turned into revenues in the form of taxes, just like alcohol and all kinds of good things. But,
yes, for anyone interested in that, the chance to hear Gabor Mate and Ethan Nadelman, in the same conference is powerful.
Yeah, and the drug war is so severely impacting Latin America. They've pretty much had it, and at the last meeting Obama had with the Latin American nations, they put it as their top priority. And so that's going to break here any day. It is really going to change.
Yes, let me just say one thing that you'll notice whenever Obama does a thing where he solicits questions for an online thing, questions about the drug war always end up number 1 or 2, and he basically ignores them. When he went down to speak to the leaders of Latin America, it ended up at the top of the agenda, and he couldn't sneak out on that one. He had to discuss it.
That's right.
So let me ask you, Kenny, one last question, and I really want a brief answer. If someone this is taking place 3 weeks before national and local elections, how does that show up at a Bioneers conference? And I'm really giving you like 30 seconds, and then I got to close.
Well, we look at the longer-term issues. These are huge, big wheels turning, and so we're not so much focused on immediate electoral returns, but I think these are the underlying issues that, really speak to what these candidates stand for and what the state of American democracy is.
Right, and going forward. This is about going forward. So again, Bioneers takes place October 19th to 21st in San Rafael, California. Ellen Brown, her websites are publicbankinginstitute.org and webofdebt.com. Bioneers' website is bioneers.org. Again, offering a discount to listeners of this show when you go online to get involved with this year's Bioneers Conference. Use BC12 TD1A, BC12 TD1A, and get a discount on your ticket. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime during the week by linking to the podcast. You can sign up to have it delivered to you weekly for podcasts, articles, and to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work. Go to TerenceMcNally.net, TerenceMcNally.net, or a world that just might work, all one word, .com. They're the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement of upcoming guests and issues, sign up at my site or email me at temcnally@mac.com. At my site, you can get podcasts that go back to 2007. It's a phenomenal archive of amazing guests and ideas. Finally, thank you to Kenny Ausubel, Ellen Brown. Keep up your good work.
Thank you.
Okay.